Picture this for a second. An ancient, yellowing piece of cloth, carefully preserved behind thick glass, and across its surface, if you look really closely, you can just barely make out this faint, almost ghostly image of a human figure. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the facts, the history, and the absolutely baffling science surrounding what is arguably one of the most fiercely debated artifacts in human history. So let's just jump right in. Is this one of history's most extraordinary religious relics? Or is it literally a medieval masterpiece of deception? The Shroud of Turin is this ultimate mystery, caught right smack in the middle of faith, history, and science. You know, millions of people look at this cloth and see the possible burial shroud of Jesus. But at the exact same time, scientists, historians, and forensic experts have spent decades arguing over its true origins. We're going to strip away all the assumptions today and look exactly at what the evidence actually tells us. All right, Section 1, Anatomy of the Shroud. Let's look at the physical evidence. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, physically, it's a piece of linen fabric, and it bears this really faint, continuous front and back image of a man. And this figure appears to have suffered severe injuries that are completely consistent with crucifixion, right down to these blood-like reddish stains scattered near the apparent wounds. Sounds relatively straightforward at first glance, right? But as researchers quickly found out, the actual makeup of this thing is incredibly puzzling. Because here is the absolute wildest part about all this. The image on this cloth does not behave like an ordinary painting or even a simple photograph. I mean, if it were just a standard medieval painting, art historians and scientists would have cracked the technique years ago, but they haven't. The visual evidence completely defies conventional explanation, which honestly forces us to look much, much closer. Moving on to Section 2, Tracing the Historical Trail. Let's follow the paper trail. How far back can we actually verifiably trace this specific piece of cloth? Well, the shroud enters clear, undeniable historical documentation in the 14th century, popping up in Liry, France. Then, moving through the post-medieval period, it gets transferred to the House of Savoy. And eventually, in the modern era, it gets relocated to Turin, Italy, which of course is exactly how it earned its famous name. But wait, here's where we hit a massive historical roadblock. We have this proposition of first-century origins, but it's pitted against documented evidence that only begins in medieval France. There is a complete and total lack of any undisputed chain of custody bridging that massive gap. Think about it. How does a first-century burial cloth suddenly just appear in Europe well over 1,000 years later? History alone just can't give us the answer. Okay, Section 3, the photographic revelation. For centuries, people could really only see what the naked eye allowed. But then, in 1898, a camera absolutely changed the game. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia was granted permission to capture the shroud. Now, this was just meant to be a really simple exercise in documentation. Nothing crazy. But what actually emerged in his darkroom altered the entire course of this investigation forever. Imagine Pia looking at his photographic plates. He was completely stunned. That faint, blurry view you get when you just look at it, gone. Instead, his photographic negative miraculously revealed way more apparent, lifelike details of the face and the body. It was as if the cloth itself was acting as a photographic negative. This mind-bending revelation just immediately captured the intense interest of scientists all over the globe. Which brings us to Section 4, the forensic anomalies. Let's talk about this baffling science. Modern science eventually stepped in and revealed some deeply startling physical properties. Step 1. The faint image doesn't actually soak through the cloth, it rests literally just on the absolute top surface fibers. Step 2. And this is wild. Researchers discovered the image actually encodes three-dimensional spatial information. That is something a standard 2D painting simply cannot do. Add Step 3 to all that, a complete absence of any obvious conventional paintbrush work. So you really have to ask yourself, how do you create a 3D encoded image on delicate surface fibers without using a brush? Now, hold on. Here is an absolutely crucial point we have to remember. Highly unusual characteristics do not automatically prove a supernatural or ancient origin. In a true forensic investigation, we have to stay absolutely impartial. Bizarre data has to be weighed incredibly carefully without just jumping to definitive conclusions. Because at the end of the day, baffling science is still just science waiting to be understood. Section 5, the blood controversy. Let's debate those stains. Aside from the actual image itself, we have those reddish stains to consider, and this has spawned a fierce ongoing debate of its own. See, some researchers claim to have positively identified these stains as genuine human blood. However, other lab findings fiercely dispute those exact conclusions, pointing instead to synthetic origins. The data here is highly contested, so we just have to neutrally acknowledge that the true origin of these stains is far, far from a settled scientific fact. And finally, Section 6, the central question. Medieval or ancient? So, we are left staring at this massive two-part puzzle. Part 1, if this is a genuine ancient burial cloth, how was the image actually created? If this piece of linen truly wrapped a man back in the 1st century, what unknown natural or physical mechanism could possibly scorch or imprint a precise 3D encoded photographic negative right onto the fabric? It challenges basically everything we currently understand about physics and ancient preservation. But honestly, flip the coin, and the alternative is equally baffling. If it is just a medieval fake, how on earth did its creators pull it off? A 14th century forger would have had to anticipate the invention of photography centuries before it happened, figure out how to encode 3D spatial data, and apply the whole image without leaving a single discernible brushstroke behind. I mean, that would literally make them the most overqualified medieval artist in human history. So we're kind of at a fascinating standstill, right? But then came the test that promised to settle the whole mystery once and for all: radiocarbon dating. They snipped a tiny piece of the cloth and ran the tests. Did it prove it was a 1st century relic or a 14th century fake? Well, the outcome of that single test sparked a massive firestorm of debate that is literally still raging to this very day. So based on all the physical anomalies and the crazy historical gaps we've just explored together, what do you choose to believe? All right, welcome to this explainer on the Shroud of Turin. For centuries, this incredible artifact has totally captivated millions with its historical and religious mystery. But today we're actually going to set aside the conjecture and we're focusing strictly on the science. What does the empirical data actually tell us about this famous piece of linen? Let's just dive right in. So, backing up to 1988, scientists really believed they finally had a way to answer the question that had been haunting the shroud for literally centuries. Just how old was this cloth? Up until that point, you see, researchers had to rely heavily on historical documents, which, let's be honest, only painted part of the picture. But the late 1980s promised something entirely different. It promised hard, objective, scientific dating that could basically put the age question to rest once and for all. Section 1. The 1988 Dating Breakthrough. Okay, so here's a quick refresher on how radiocarbon dating actually works. Living things naturally absorb carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope. When a plant, like the flax used to weave the shroud's linen, dies, it completely stops absorbing that carbon-14. And the carbon that's already trapped inside, well, it begins to decay at a very known, highly predictable rate. So by measuring how much radiocarbon is actually left in a sample of the cloth, scientists can calculate roughly when the flax was harvested. It essentially acts like a highly accurate molecular clock. Now, to ensure absolute accuracy, scientists treated this literally like a covert operation. Tiny samples were carefully removed and sent off to 3 world-renowned laboratories: Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona. And to avoid absolutely any bias, these labs conducted the tests completely blind. They totally refused to communicate their findings to one another until the very end. And when those results were finally unsealed, well, the numbers completely aligned. All 3 labs placed the linen's origin firmly in the medieval period, specifically between the 13th and 14th centuries. For a lot of folks in the mainstream scientific community at the time, this was the smoking gun. Case closed, right? The cloth was officially determined to be a medieval creation. Section 2. Controversies and disputed findings. But, of course, science thrives on scrutiny, and researchers pretty quickly pointed out a massive potential flaw, which was the sampled location. See, the sample was taken from a corner of the cloth that had been heavily handled, grabbed, touched, and even repaired over the centuries. From smoke to sweat to literal medieval patch jobs, researchers really started questioning if that tested portion truly represented the original cloth at all. Now, while alternative studies using different methods have argued for much older dates, it's absolutely essential to note that the 1988 test still remains the primary dating benchmark, even amidst all this fierce debate. Section 3. Other scientific evidence. Because age is really just one piece of the puzzle here. Over the years, researchers have essentially put the shroud through a modern forensics lab. They've traced its weaving style by looking at microscopic fibers. They've scoured the cloth for biological clues, things like ancient pollen and complex bloodstains. They've even used topographic tools to reveal that the image is actually encoded with 3D information. But here's your key takeaway for all this. None of these lines of evidence individually establishes the shroud's definitive identity. They just add these really fascinating layers to an artifact that's already incredibly complicated.
Section 4. The image formation mystery.
So if we set aside the whole dating controversy for just a second, the physical image itself is a total scientific marvel. Like, how was it made? Was it a masterful medieval artist using highly diluted, almost invisible pigments? Was it some bizarre chemical reaction between burial spices, sweat, and the cloth? Some people have even suggested intense, split-second bursts of radiation. Yet, despite all of our modern technology, no single mechanism has ever been conclusively proven to reproduce every single feature of the shroud.
Section 5. The medieval forgery question.
Which leaves us with this really fascinating scientific paradox. On one side, you have mainstream radiocarbon dating firmly shouting medieval origin. But on the other side, you've got an immense replication challenge. I mean, reproducing the shroud's negative-like image, the extremely superficial penetration of the color on those fibers, and that 3D data, it remains incredibly difficult even today. But just keep this rule of logic in mind. The sheer inability to reproduce an artifact doesn't automatically prove it's ancient or supernatural. It just means our current scientific understanding is incomplete.
Section 6. Science, Faith, and Mystery. Now, because the shroud obviously holds massive cultural and religious weight, we really have to draw a line in the sand here. Science has hard limits. It can measure physical traits, it can break down the chemistry, and it can trace historical documents. But science cannot independently prove a theological claim about whose exact burial cloth this might have been. It can answer the what and the how, but matters of faith sit entirely outside the realm of empirical data.
So, after evaluating all the suspects, the methods, and the evidence in this giant forensic puzzle, we're kind of forced to ask the ultimate question. Is the Shroud of Turin real, or is it a fake? Well, we have to give a balanced, evidence-based conclusion here. The most widely accepted dating evidence absolutely points to a medieval origin, which means it has not been scientifically established as the burial cloth of Jesus. But simply writing the whole thing off as a fake completely ignores the deeply unresolved physical anomalies that honestly continue to baffle modern scientists. The data shows it's a massive, multidisciplinary enigma. It's just way too complex for a simple one-word answer. As we picture the shroud sitting behind bulletproof glass in Turin today, it's just incredible to reflect on how a single artifact unites so many different fields of study. It's a really rare crossroads. This one simple piece of linen has brought together religion, archaeology, chemistry, physics, photography, history, and just raw, undeniable human curiosity. I want to leave you with a final thought on where we stand today. Perhaps the Shroud of Turin is an extraordinary medieval artifact. Perhaps some questions about its creation remain unanswered. But one thing is certain. The mystery has survived for centuries because the evidence is fascinating, the history is complicated, and the final answer remains deeply contested. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. I'll leave you with this. If it truly is just a medieval forgery, how on earth did a 14th century artist encode three-dimensional photographic negative information into a piece of linen centuries before those concepts even existed? Keep questioning history, and I'll catch you next time.